Hey, welcome back to the shop. We are on the home stretch. We are on video number 3. This will go into the HVAC recovery, leak testing, and flushing. So finally, we are on the home stretch in order to get your AC up and running. That way you can have nice, cool air with this hot summer that is coming. So we've gone over in the first video flow, which gets you acquainted with the components. In the second video, we went over pressure testing in order to troubleshoot your system in regards to pressure. So now we are going into the recovery so that if you had a problem with your pressure test, you'll now know what to do for your next step. So we are going to go ahead and start with the first thing, leak test. Now with leak testing, there are two methods that are normally used. There is a third that's not a method, but it helps you check, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, the first method that comes to mind when leak testing an AC system is usually what everybody knows about. It's the dye test. So basically what they do is they take a fluorescent dye and they get pretty much with this kit here, which comes with the gun, the fluorescent dye, the yellow glass, the safety glasses, and the flashlight, as well as recharger and whatever else that you need. They hook it up to your system while your vehicle is off. They inject a specific amount of dye into your system, and they normally inject it on the low side. So because they don't, of course this is a liquid, they don't want to slug up the compressor, so they inject on the low side. They start up the vehicle, turn on the system, and they run the system and get that dye circulating around, because what happens is that dye is going to go to the spot for a leak. It will start to come out. Now the flashlight is a black light, and the black light reacts to the fluorescent dye, basically the UV light. So you wear the yellow glasses because this helps that stain stick out amongst everything else in the brightest of light. Kind of like they show on CSI when they're using the luminol. So they'll use this dye, they'll go through and they'll basically look for this fluorescence coming out of wherever, if it's coming out by the compressor, if it's coming out by the condenser. Now the evaporator is going to be a little difficult because that's inside your cab and that's behind the dashboard, but they'll be able to pretty much do the same thing for that. But instead of that, they can use this other thing, this other leak test, which is basically the electronic sniffer. So with the electronic leak detector, basically the charge has to be no less than 50% in your system. And what this leak detector will do is, I'll show it here. Here's the picture of it. I'll show the leak detector. Once you turn it on, it basically captures the scent. It sniffs and detects for those specific chemicals, and you can run it in the dash, in the vents, and it will give you a signal, and the signal will get stronger as you get closer. Alright, and that will basically pretty much cover leak detection. Now we'll go into recovery. Okay, so with recovery utilizes an AC machine. This machine has multiple functions that it performs in order to recover refrigerant. It doesn't just recover refrigerant, but we'll go to each of the components as it goes along. And please forgive me, I have some notes because there's quite a bit of information in order to explain this accurately. So basically, the recovery machine, when you get started, you want to do like you do with pretty much all your equipment. You want to conduct an inspection. You want to go ahead and you want to inspect the plug. You want to pull the hose and inspect the hoses for the high and the low, and make sure that there are no cracks, there's no dry rot, anything like that. People tend to have a habit of stepping on hoses when they're laying on the floor, or stepping on cords, so you want to make sure that there's no cracks or anything to that extent. The other thing you want to do is you want to inspect the port connectors. Again, like I said before, making sure that all the pathways are clear, that all the retaining beads are still in, that the shoulder locking mechanism still works, or I'm sorry, collar locking mechanism still works. It retracts and comes back to the original position. And you want to make sure that it is open, because there's that small pin that when it's closed, that pin, it pushes that pin forward, which could release the refrigerant into the atmosphere. So you want to unscrew that so that it goes back. So after you're done inspecting all the components, you're going to want to go ahead and plug in the machine and turn it on. Now, after it's turned on, it's going to go through a series of system checks. While it's doing that, you can go ahead and hook up your high and low side. And once that's connected, now this machine will basically it'll reclaim everything in the system. So everything that's in the system, it will pull out and filter and separate. Now, as you can see right here, this system has basically a separate storage container for the oil. So when it reclaims the oil, it fills that up, so it'll tell you how much oil was in the system. You want to make sure that that is empty before you start, so that way you will know how much oil was in the system. So that way you can get a good reading. Now, like I said, this machine will, once you set it and you get it started, it will start reclaiming everything from that system. It'll start pulling in all the refrigerant, anything mixed with the refrigerant, the oil, the crud, everything, and it'll filter it out. Now, inside this system is basically a scale, and this scale is connected to the computer, and so the computer will read the weight of the interior container to tell you how much refrigerant has been reclaimed. So when you're doing this process of reclaiming, you don't want to touch the machine. So don't touch the machine, because you will mess with the scale. It will not give you an accurate reading. And like I said before, as it reclaims, it also separates that oil, puts it into the container on the side, so you'll get a separate reading of the oil, and you will get a reading of the refrigerant, how much refrigerant was actually in the system. So after everything is said and done as far as the reclaiming, it will go into a vacuum setting. So automatically it will start up a vacuum, and that vacuum will vacuum out any remaining moisture that may be present in your system. Because water, when put into a vacuum, the molecules basically, like flash boils, the molecules will expand and separate. They're not being held together by a specific gravity, so they just separate into a mist, and that will get sucked out, and you will see that coming out of your machine. It'll look like your machine is vaping, like certain people in our shop. And so you'll see that vapor coming out of the machine, expanding into the air. It will have kind of a scent to it because it had been mixed with the refrigerant and everything else that is in that AC system. So you'll notice kind of an odor. But so that will go. Now, after the machine has done the vacuum, at the end of the vacuum, here's one of the things that I had talked about that you can use as a check. And what this will do, this also helps check for leaks. Basically a leak that will cause an exposure to the atmosphere. So what will happen is, if you're creating a vacuum, you'll see the needle go down, and the needle should normally bury itself at approximately 3 mercury, or -3 mercury. So it should be buried on both the high and the low. Now it should maintain that vacuum. If it doesn't maintain that vacuum and the needle goes back to its 0 setting, you have a leak. If it maintains this vacuum, you don't have a leak. So you can basically go from there. Now, at this point, you have recovered everything out of your AC system. It's been vacuumed. Now is the time that you can basically go and start your project. So you start your repair. If you're replacing any component, that's where you can start doing that. Now remember, when you're replacing the component, the lines have a vacuum. There will be a suction. You're not releasing the gas. Just be aware of that. But also make note that you have now just exposed the system to the atmosphere while making that repair. So you need to keep that in mind, because it's important for the next steps after the repair. So after your components are placed, make sure everything is tightened, torqued down to spec. Everything is free and clear and clean. Make sure when you're applying the component, some of the components may be pre-oiled, and you want to definitely check to see if the component you're putting on has already been pre-oiled. If not, make sure that you get the right oil, the correct weight of oil, and apply the correct amount of oil per spec from your owner's manual. So now that you've replaced the part, it's time to get your system charged up. But before we do that charge, we want to go into the next step, which is flushing your system. So you've just installed the new part, but it's not fully installed. You want to take the time to take off the lines, and you basically want to get a flush kit, which is here. Now, flushing the system will keep the new parts from becoming contaminated with anything that might have contaminated and caused a problem for the old part. So one of the things, the reason why you want to flush is because the refrigerant inside can become caustic, can become acidic, and start to eat away at metals. They could basically, it breaks down the desiccant filter and will start releasing desiccant particles which will cause clogs. So the other reason for the flow is that you can have an oversaturated desiccant, and so you have a lot of moisture in the system. So there's a lot that you want to clean out by doing this flush. Now, when you do a flush, there are components that you cannot flush. So some of these components are the accumulator or dryer, the TXV valve or orifice tube, the compressor, and that should be about it. So those items, you cannot flush those items. You don't want to, you can cause damage to them. What you can flush is you can't flush the compressor. You can flush the condenser, the evaporator, and all the lines and hoses. Now when you perform a flush, you want to actually flush the system in the opposite direction that the system runs in, so that it helps clean out the system better. You don't want to go in the same direction. You don't want to push a clog or particles further into your evaporator or your condenser. You basically want to flush it back out the other way. With the flush, of course, as I showed, there is the flush system. Now, you want to make sure that with the system that you don't really want to use shop air. I know it's not always an option. Sometimes you have to, but you don't want to use shop air. What you want to use is a dry nitrogen in dealing with these materials, because the dry nitrogen allows for better evaporation. Once everything has been pushed out and the nitrogen evaporates, there's nothing left in your system, so there won't be any residue. And also, the higher quality of the solvent that you use when cleaning your system also allows for a better evaporation, a better clean. Make sure that you're flushing one component at a time, that you don't have several components connected to each other. Every hose has to be flushed individually, every component flushed individually. So if you do that, everything should be nice and clean. Reinstall everything, get everything back connected with your new parts. Your lines will almost be like new. Have everything connected, and then we'll move on to charging the system. Okay, so now we are charging the system. You have your brand new component on, and we're going to start taking the next steps. So when you reconnect your AC machine, you're going to notice that your gauges will read 0. Why is this? Well, this goes back to what I had mentioned before. When you open up the system, you release that vacuum of pressure and let air and atmosphere come into your system. So you will read a 0 pressure. It will be an even atmospheric pressure. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set the machine to vacuum. Now, this vacuum may take a while. It's based on where you live. I'm here in Florida. It would be different if I was back home in Arizona. The time difference on how long you need a vacuum. A lot of humidity out here in Florida versus Arizona. So you're probably going to want a 45-minute vacuum on your system. In Arizona, probably not as long, because of the less humidity, the least amount of humidity, but there will always be humidity. So you want to create that vacuum, get all that moisture out of the system. You want a completely dry system. Okay, so after you run the vacuum again at the end, this vacuum should hold a negative pressure. You can check the vacuum again to see if that needle bears back to 0 while it's holding. If it doesn't hold, you still have a leak. If it is holding, your system is good, and then you can move on to charging your system. Now, when you charge your system, you're basically, most machines want you to pre-select the unit. Some will automatically know the amount, but you can most machines you're probably going to have to set the amount. You're going to have to look that up in your manufacturer's specs, your owner's manual. That'll tell you the amount. The system that we're working on is approximately 44 ounces, so we would set it to ounces, and we would basically set it to 44. Now remember what I said, the inside, it basically senses by weight. So it doesn't go by it doesn't have an actual meter that's going to read it. It's going to go by weight. It can calculate how much refrigerant is in the canister by what the weight says, and how much has been released by how light it gets. So it'll go ahead and it will charge up the system. Again, do not mess with the machine as it's doing its charge, because it is reading off of a scale. You mess up that scale, you could prematurely have cause the machine to stop. And then you won't know how much refrigerant you have. You'll have to start the process all over again. So do not disturb the unit. Once it's finished, your system is recharged. You want to go ahead and disconnect. Make sure you put the caps back on the ports. and clean everything up, and you will have a fully charged unit, and you'll have nice AC. Now, what you want to do is, after you've finished, you're going to want to go ahead and conduct a test. You're going to want to start the system up. You're going to want to get a thermal reading from the vents to make sure that it's at its proper temperature, between 40 and 50 degrees, depending on your system, and see how cold that it's coming out. Once you've run the system and you've completed your checks, you are good to go. So thank you for joining me in this 3-part series. I know it's been thrilling. So we'll see you again when I go into hydraulics for my next 5 weeks. All right, thank you, and stay dirty.